On a quiet night at an abandoned train station, a corrupt sheriff thought he had erased a woman who knew too much. Tied to the tracks, seconds away from a speeding train, she seemed doomed, until her son, an FBI agent, arrived just in time. But this isn't just a rescue mission. It's a battle against corruption, power, and the fight for justice. How will he bring down the man who almost took everything from him? Watch until the end to find out. And don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The night was eerily silent, wrapping around the small, isolated train station on the outskirts of Cedar Creek, like a heavy blanket. The streetlights had long since flickered out, leaving only the dim glow of the moon to illuminate the desolate platform. There were no passengers, no station attendants, just the howling wind sweeping through abandoned buildings and the distant hum of crickets in the fields beyond. But beneath the stillness, a horrifying scene was unfolding. Angela Williams, a middle-aged black woman with fire in her eyes, lay bound to the cold steel tracks. Thick ropes cut into her wrists, her legs shackled with a rusted chain that dug into her skin. She twisted and struggled, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The distant whistle of an approaching train echoed through the night, growing louder with every passing second. Towering over her, Sheriff Travis Beckett stood with a smug grin. His uniform was crisp, but his soul was rotten. With his hands resting casually on his belt, he studied Angela as if she were nothing more than an insect beneath his boot. Angela's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and unwavering. "Why are you doing this, Beckett? I've done nothing wrong." Beckett crouched beside her, his pale fingers tracing the dirt near the tracks, like a predator toying with its prey. "Wrong?" he mused, letting out a low chuckle. "You think exposing the sheriff of this town isn't a mistake? You talk too much, Angela. I gave you chances to keep quiet, but you just couldn't help yourself." His smirk widened. "Now, you won't be around to cause any more trouble." Angela's jaw clenched. Fear simmered beneath her defiance, but she refused to let it show. "My son won't let this slide. Dante knows everything. He'll come for you." Beckett snorted and stood up, dusting off his uniform like their conversation had been nothing more than idle chatter. "Oh, your big-shot FBI son." He shook his head. "Let him try. By the time he gets here, it'll be over." The whistle shrieked again, the ground beneath them trembling as the train neared. Angela's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. Sweat trickled down her temple, but her resolve remained firm. She wasn't afraid of dying. What terrified her was the possibility that Beckett would get away with it, that the truth would die with her. Closing her eyes, she took a slow, steady breath before whispering, "Dante is coming. And when he does, you'll wish you had never touched me." Angela Williams' body trembled against the unyielding steel of the tracks, but it wasn't from fear. It was rage, even as the ropes burned her wrists and the cold metal bit into her skin. She refused to give Beckett the satisfaction of seeing her break. Sheriff Travis Beckett stood above her, arms crossed, his smug grin widening as he listened to the approaching train. The faint rumble of the tracks beneath them grew stronger. Angela exhaled sharply. "This is how you solve your problems, Beckett? Silencing anyone who speaks the truth?" Beckett let out a slow chuckle, kneeling down beside her, his fingers tracing the rough fibers of the rope. "You think this is about you, Angela," he said, tilting his head. "No, sweetheart. You're just the latest in a long line of people who didn't know when to keep their mouths shut." Angela's jaw tightened. "You're scared," she said, her voice steady. "That's why you're doing this." Beckett's smirk twitched, just for a second, before he forced a laugh. "Oh, please." He shook his head. "Scared? Of what?" Your little crusade. This town belongs to men like me. I decide what justice looks like here." Angela forced herself to stay calm, even as she pulled at her restraints. "You think no one will ask questions when I disappear?" Beckett scoffed. "Disappear? Oh, no. You'll be another tragic accident. A misstep on the tracks, a foolish mistake. People will mourn, of course. Your little friends, your community. But eventually they'll forget." Angela's heart pounded against her ribs, but her face remained unreadable. "And my son?" she asked quietly. Beckett's smirk returned. "Your son? The big-shot FBI agent?" He scoffed. "By the time he hears about this, there won't be anything left to investigate." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching over her. "Face it, Angela, no one is coming to save you." Angela met his gaze, unblinking. "You don't know my son." Beckett's face twitched, but he quickly masked it with another chuckle. "Hope's a funny thing, isn't it?" He reached for his gun holster, as if considering finishing the job himself before the train could. "I almost admire it." Angela clenched her fists, fighting against the restraints. The ground beneath her vibrated harder now. The train was close, too close. She had only moments left. She twisted her wrists, ignoring the sting as the rope bit into her skin. If she could loosen just one knot, she could. Beckett suddenly grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "Don't bother," he said coolly. "You're not getting out of this." Angela glared at him. "Neither are you." Beckett smirked. "Oh, I think I'll be just fine." Then, without another word, he stood, took a step back, and turned toward his patrol car, whistling as if he hadn't just condemned her to death. Angela gritted her teeth. Her hands burned as she pulled harder at the ropes. She had no idea if Dante even knew where she was, but she had to hold on. She had to believe. The train's horn blared, slicing through the night air like a scream. Beckett didn't even turn around. Angela closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. "Hold on, Dante, please, son. Hurry." Dante Williams gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His SUV tore through the empty back roads of Cedar Creek, the speedometer needle inching dangerously close to the red zone. The night air rushed past his half-open window, but all he could hear was the deafening sound of his own heartbeat. His mother was in danger. The call had come from an anonymous tip, short, urgent, and full of panic. "Angela Williams. Train tracks. Hurry." That was all. That was enough. Dante's jaw clenched as he dialed his FBI field office through the hands-free system. The line clicked. "This is Agent Carter." "Carter, it's Williams. I need backup at Cedar Creek train station. Now." "Williams?" Agent Carter's voice sharpened. "What's going on?" "My mother's life is at risk," Dante said, his voice tight with fury. "And I think Sheriff Beckett is behind it." A beat of silence. Then Carter's voice came back, steady and professional. "Understood. I'll dispatch a unit. ETA 15 minutes. "I don't have 15 minutes, Dante growled. He ended the call and pushed the SUV harder, the tires screeching against the pavement. The station was less than 5 miles away now. He needed to get there. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Her warmth, her unwavering strength. She had raised him to fight for justice, to stand against corruption. She had taught him that silence was never an option. And now, because of that, she was in danger. Not on my watch. Dante's eyes flicked to the dashboard, the train schedule. His mother's voice teaching him to always pay attention to the details. The night freight train. 11:45 p.m. He glanced at the clock. 11:42 p.m. Damn it. His foot pressed harder on the gas. The town's streetlights blurred past him. He could feel the tension coiling in his muscles. the adrenaline buzzing through his veins. Every second mattered. As he veered onto the final stretch of road leading to the station, he reached for his holster, making sure his firearm was secure. If Beckett was there, this wouldn't just be a rescue. It would be a confrontation. The station came into view. His stomach lurched. And then he saw her, tied to the tracks. His breath hitched. The scene was like something out of a nightmare. The ropes binding her wrists, the faint glint of a metal chain around her legs. And just beyond her, Sheriff Beckett stood with his back to the approaching train, arms crossed, watching her struggle like a spectator at a show. Dante's rage exploded. He slammed the brakes, tires screeching, as the SUV skidded to a halt. The train's horn blared, closer now, seconds away. He didn't hesitate. He threw open the door and sprinted toward the tracks, his gun already drawn. "Beckett!" he roared. The sheriff turned, his smug grin freezing the moment he saw Dante. "Step away from her," Dante ordered, his voice low, deadly. Beckett smirked. Well, well. The prodigal son returns. He took a slow step forward, arms loose at his sides, like a man without a care in the world. "Afraid you're a little late, Agent Williams." Dante's finger tightened around the trigger. "I won't say it again." The train's whistle shrieked. Less than 30 seconds. Angela lifted her head, her eyes locking onto Dante's. He saw the exhaustion, the pain, but most of all, he saw the unwavering belief. She had known he would come. Now, he just had to save her in time. Dante's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of the rushing train. His gun was steady, his stance unshaken, but his heart thundered in his chest as he stared down the man who had dared to put his mother's life on the line. Sheriff Travis Beckett smirked, standing his ground between Dante and Angela, as if the mere presence of his badge would shield him from the consequences of his actions. His fingers hovered near his holstered weapon, his posture oozing arrogance. "You should have stayed in D.C., Agent Williams," Beckett drawled, his voice almost casual. "This ain't your jurisdiction." Dante didn't flinch. "Step away from her, now." Beckett chuckled. "Or what? You gonna shoot me, boy? You think your little FBI credentials make you untouchable?" Dante's eyes flickered toward Angela. She was still struggling against the ropes, her breath ragged. The train's horn blared, louder this time, the metal tracks beginning to vibrate beneath her. Less than 20 seconds. Dante's grip on his gun tightened. "Last warning." Beckett sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "See? That's the problem with you government types. Always thinking you can walk into a town and tell us how to do our jobs. But let me tell you something, Agent." Dante moved. In a split second, he closed the distance between them, grabbing Beckett's wrist, just as the sheriff went for his gun. A struggle erupted, grappling hands, gritted teeth, a burst of raw force as they fought for control. Beckett twisted, yanking his arm free, but Dante was faster. He drove his elbow into Beckett's ribs, forcing a grunt from the sheriff. The gun slipped from Beckett's fingers, clattering against the gravel. Beckett staggered back, wheezing. "You think you're tough, huh?" Dante didn't answer. He spun and delivered a brutal kick to the back of Beckett's knee, sending the sheriff crashing to the ground. 10 seconds. Dante didn't have time to waste. He turned and dropped to his knees beside his mother, his hands flying to the knots binding her wrists. Angela gasped as the rope loosened. "Dante, I've got you, Mom," he breathed, his fingers working fast. The train's light blazed through the darkness, blinding, the roar deafening. The massive engine was almost on them, the heat of its approach sending waves of hot air against Dante's back. 5 seconds. The last knot gave way. Dante lunged, yanking Angela free, just as the train thundered past. They tumbled into the dirt, the sheer force of the train's passage sending dust and debris flying around them. For a moment, all Dante could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Then, his mother's breathing, shaky but alive. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're okay," he whispered, his arms still around her. "You're okay." Angela coughed, gripping his forearm. "You always were the stubborn one," she rasped, her voice weak but laced with relief. Dante managed a strained smile, pressing his forehead against hers for a brief second before pulling away. He turned sharply. "Beckett." The sheriff was back on his feet, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. His gun was gone, but the look in his eyes was murderous. Dante rose slowly, his body shifting into a defensive stance. "It's over, Beckett." Beckett wiped the blood from his face, then let out a low, humorless laugh. "You think you've won?" He gestured around them. "Look at where you are, Agent. You're in my town. My rules." Dante's gun was still in his holster, but he didn't need it. He could see it in Beckett's stance, the slight tremor in his hands, the nervous tick in his jaw. The man was unraveling. "Your rules?" Dante repeated. "Then why are you sweating?" Beckett's nostrils flared. "I'll make sure this gets buried," he spat. "You think the system's on your side. I own this town. You won't." Red and blue lights flooded the station. FBI vehicles skidded into the lot, doors flying open. Agents stormed forward, guns raised. Beckett froze. Dante smirked. "You were saying?" Beckett barely had time to react before he was swarmed by federal agents. They forced him to the ground, handcuffs snapping around his wrists. Angela, still weak, sat up and watched as Beckett was dragged to his feet. She let out a shaky breath. "Told you my son would come for me." Beckett's face twisted with fury. But Dante just leaned in close, his voice low and lethal. "This is my jurisdiction now." And with that, Sheriff Travis Beckett was finally brought to justice. The flashing red and blue lights painted the old train station in eerie colors, illuminating the dust still hanging in the air. Dante stood over Beckett, watching as two FBI agents shoved the disgraced sheriff into the back of a black SUV. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back, his once smug expression now twisted with fury and disbelief. "This isn't over," Beckett spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think locking me up changes anything? The system is bigger than you, Agent Williams." Dante folded his arms, his stance unwavering. "You're right," he said calmly. "The system is big, but tonight you're just another criminal in cuffs, and I'll make sure you never hurt anyone else again." Beckett let out a bitter laugh as the FBI agents slammed the door shut behind him. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night, but Dante knew this was only the beginning. He turned to find Angela sitting on the station's platform steps, wrapped in a blanket, still catching her breath. Her wrists were red and raw, but her spirit was unbroken. She met his gaze, her lips curling into a small, exhausted smile. "You came?" she whispered. Dante knelt beside her, placing a firm but gentle hand over hers. "Of course I did," he said. "I always will." Angela exhaled shakily, looking out toward the now empty tracks. "I thought that was it," she admitted, her voice quieter. "That I wasn't going to make it." Dante's jaw tightened, the thought alone making his chest ache. "He never should have been able to do this to you." Angela squeezed his hand. "He wasn't the only one." Dante met her eyes, understanding what she meant. Beckett had been the one who tied her to those tracks, but he hadn't acted alone. He had been protected, emboldened by a system that allowed him to believe he was untouchable. Dante stood, pulling out his phone. "We're not done yet," he said, scrolling through his contacts. "Beckett wasn't working alone, and I'm going to make sure every last one of his allies goes down with him." Angela nodded, her expression hardening. "We fight together." Just then, Agent Carter approached, his face grim. "Williams, we've already started digging into Beckett's records. It's worse than we thought. Bribes, cover-ups, connections to state-level officials. This isn't just a small-town problem." Dante nodded, already expecting it. "I want every name, every crooked cop, every politician who took his money. We make this public." Carter hesitated. "You realize this is dangerous?" Dante glanced at his mother, then back at Carter. "Justice is always dangerous, but we're not backing down." Angela stood, despite her exhaustion, standing shoulder to shoulder with her son. "This town deserves the truth," she said. And with that, the real battle had only just begun. The sun was just beginning to rise over Cedar Creek, casting a golden hue over the quiet town. The night's chaos had settled, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. Dante stood outside his mother's home, sipping a cup of coffee, his mind racing. Angela stepped onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from the ordeal. Dante exhaled, shaking his head. "Too much left to do." Angela sat down beside him, looking out at the street. "Beckett is gone. But this fight isn't over, is it?" Dante turned to her, his expression serious. "Number? The FBI is digging deeper. Beckett's arrest opened a door we can't close. There are others, politicians, officers, people in power who let this happen." He took a sip of his coffee before adding, "And I'm going after them." Angela studied her son for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." He arched an eyebrow. "You're not going to tell me to be careful?" She smirked. "You're my son. I know better than to think I can stop you." Dante chuckled softly. "Fair point." Angela reached over, squeezing his hand. "Just promise me one thing. When this is over, when they're all exposed, you'll take a moment to breathe, to live." Dante looked at her, seeing the exhaustion behind her strength, the fight that had taken so much from her. He nodded. "I promise." For the first time in a long time, Angela smiled. The battle wasn't over. But for now, mother and son sat together, watching the sun rise over a town that finally had hope again. The story of Angela and Dante Williams is more than just an intense thriller. It reflects real struggles against corruption, injustice, and abuse of power. In many communities, systemic corruption thrives when people remain silent out of fear. This story serves as a powerful reminder that silence enables oppression, and that it often takes bravery, persistence, and sacrifice to expose the truth. One key lesson is the importance of accountability. Sheriff Beckett operated for years under the assumption that no one would challenge him. However, when someone like Angela dared to stand up, and when Dante used his position in the FBI to bring justice, it proved that no one is above the law. This applies to our daily lives, whether in the workplace, in our communities, or even in politics. Corruption can only thrive if people look the other way. Another takeaway is the power of resilience and standing together. Angela could not have escaped on her own, but her belief in her son and her refusal to give in made the difference. This reminds us that change doesn't happen alone. Justice requires collective effort. The question we must ask ourselves is, when we see injustice, will we have the courage to stand up and fight, or will we look away? Today's story is more than just an intense rescue. It's a powerful reminder of justice and responsibility. When faced with injustice, Which path would you choose? Would you be like Dante, fighting fearlessly to expose the truth and protect the people you love? 1. Or would you choose to keep yourself safe, compromise, and avoid the risks? 2. Leave a comment with 1 or 2 below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story to spread the message.